Ladies and gentlemen, friends and open-minded people, wherever you live, this is David Duke, and this is Human Freedom Radio. We believe in the right of every people to be free and independent, and we recognize the danger of Jewish extremism, Jewish racism, and this comes about through tribalism. And today, I've got a show that's going to knock your socks off. I think it's one of the most important shows I believe I've ever done, because I'm going to go into detail about what's called the Khazar Theory. And I believe it's so important and so vital for those who oppose Zionism and Jewish extremism to understand the fundamental aspects of the problem. And again, the problem is rooted in a tribalism, in an ethnocentrism, in a racism. The reason they dominate the media, the reason they dominate the Ivy League, the reason they dominate finance is not because they're smarter, it's because they are more racist. They are organized. They have all these groups spending billions and billions of dollars to advance their interests. They control the political contribution process in the United States. They control much of the media and tailor that media to promote what they see to be their agenda. And there is a theory, and it's been around for a long time, and I must tell you that I was totally in agreement with the theory originally. When I first began to understand the ultra-racist, supremacist ideology of Judaism and Zionism, and of course, by the way, one thing that we try to explain here in this program is that they're both related. You couldn't even have Zionism without Judaism. Zionism is simply an outgrowth of Judaistic, racist, supremacist, chosenness, ideology, and orthodoxy. Israel is, in fact, a Jewish state, but it's also a racist state, the ultimate racist state. And it's ultimately vital and important to understand, if you can't understand the Jews as a people, as a genetically connected people, that's what gives them so much of their unity. It's not just orthodoxy. It's not just the Jewish religion, because many of them are not religious. It's been a very closely knit reproductive group. It's been a closed gene pool. There has been certainly some admixtures at different times in history, and there's a lot of evidence, and I'm going to go into this in this broadcast, that there's been admixture of some European genes and the Middle Eastern genes of the Jewish people. When I was a young man, when I first came into contact with a theory that present-day Jews are genetically unrelated to the historical Jewish community, for instance, in the Middle East, when I first came into contact with it, I believed it. The allegation is known as the Khazar Theory. And I really want to ask all of you to be very open-minded here, and because we get wedded to certain beliefs that we have, and for many years I was wedded to the belief, or convinced of the belief, that the Khazar Theory was accurate. Sometimes it takes a lot of really good thinking, a lot of good scientific research and understanding to figure out what the ultimate truth is. Now, the allegation known as the Khazar Theory is that Ashkenazim Jews of today are actually the descendants of the Khazar people. Now, that was essentially a Central Asiatic tribe that allegedly converted to Judaism in the 9th century AD. And it's claimed that these newly minted Jews then migrated to what is now Russia, Eastern Europe, and later Western and Northern Europe. Now, on my site, I have this article. We just posted it up. I think you're going to find it very interesting. It's very well documented. The citations are there. The scientific research is there. And genes speak more clearly than anything. But I show the three major forces behind the acceptance of the Khazar Theory. And guess what, folks? All three are basically communist Jews, believe it or not. It's interesting. The Khazar Theory was launched and is still to this day driven primarily by communist Jews. Now, it's ironic that the three most prominent exponents of this theory are people that say, or Jews that say, that the Jews are not a race. And yet you look at the three components, the three people, Arthur Koestler, a communist Jew who wrote the 13th Tribe, which was probably what propelled this theory in the 20th century. It's amazing when we start going into this thing. The Jewish geneticist Eran El.Haik, he looks like the archetypical Jewish person. And Shlomo Sand, that's an Israeli academic, supporter of Israel, really. He might be, quote, anti-Zionist, but this guy was a member of the Union of Israeli Communist Youth. Now, all three maintain that large numbers of present-day Jews are completely genetically unrelated to the Middle Eastern origin Jews who wrote the Babylonian Talmud. And all maintain that there's no such thing as a Jewish race. I want to suggest to you that not understanding that the Jews are, in fact, a people with similar values, similar, even maybe similar genetic structure, is a way of basically contradicting the idea of Jewish tribalism. It's not just Jewish identity, as some of my good friends say in the anti-Zionist movement. There is a link, both genetic and historical and religious and, in terms of culture, to all these things. And there is a lot of evidence, in fact, that we have certain tendencies because of the selection process. It's called genetics, it's called evolution. It's called evolutionary strategy. Dr. Kevin McDonald talks about it, that there's a lot of links for certain behavior that is similar. Now, these Jewish Marxists basically want to put out to the world that the Jews are not a race, even though Jewish leaders constantly refer to themselves as a race. I have a quotation in the article by Netanyahu, I guess the most prominent Jewish leader in the world, right? It's talking about the Jewish race and preserving the Jewish race and the survival of the Jewish race. And what is a race? A race basically is an ethnically similar people of a background. There certainly may be some admixture with other races. There are many races on the earth of humanity, but they have certain things to a great extent in common, and they're identifiable. And for years, folks, listen, and by the way, if after this broadcast, and I hope that there are many people out here that will take this broadcast and turn it into make a video, put it into your video editing program, make this video, put some of our illustrations, and please put respectful illustrations. Don't put wild, crazy illustrations up of these things. But there's a lot of amazing illustrations in this video, and there's other illustrations you can get to show it. And let me tell you something. If after you listen to my ideas, please be open-minded and listen to them. If you disagree with me, fine. If you're an opponent of Zionism and Jewish extremism, great. I will stand shoulder to shoulder with you in the battle against Zionism and Jewish supremacism and Jewish racism. But please understand that we have different opinions, and sometimes there are different opinions about these issues. And I'm just asking you to examine some of the evidence maybe you've never seen before or never thought about deeply, and follow with me during this broadcast, and we'll discuss some of these issues. Now, again, for years I accepted the Khazar theory as true. After all, it was repeated by some writers who also recognized the leading role, the Jewish role, in communism, in the Red Terror of the Soviet Union, and their leadership in many other subversive movements that were directed against the family, European heritage, European values, and of course, that have really led the media of the world, which I think a degradation of humanity, not just of Europeans, but of all people, promotion of drugs and alcohol abuse and sexual abuse and objectification of women rather than as the mothers of our children and the healthy families. They have led so many of these movements. And it was only later that I considered the question logically and scientifically. And that's when my doubts about the Khazar theory were aroused. There are three fundamental issues which need to be addressed in the scientific evidence, the historical, logical evidence, and the reasons why theory came about. In other words, what was the purpose of the Khazar theory, or what was there maybe let's put it this way, was there perhaps a purpose in promoting this to achieve certain political ends or certain psychological ends among the people? Let's talk about the scientific evidence first. Now, there are actually hundreds of studies, but I list 12 fairly recent DNA studies, extensive studies that really preserve the Khazar theory. You know, they always say the truth is in the genes. These studies are both by many Gentiles and Jews, and they're all over the world, universities all over the world, okay? Many different universities, many different departments, many different ethnic groups. There are Japanese doing these studies, Asians doing these studies, Africans doing these studies, Europeans doing these studies, Jews doing the studies, Christians doing the studies, okay? There's a lot of hardcore scientific studies being done on the Jewish genome. It's a very interesting subject. Let's start with the first one. A 1999 study entitled Jewish and Middle Eastern Non-Jewish Populations show and says that they share a common pool of Y chromosome allelic haplotypes. All right? And to quote it, it says, despite their long-term residence in different countries in isolation from one another, most Jewish populations were not significantly different from one another at the genetic level. Quote, admixture estimates, this is genetic studies, folks, suggested low levels of European Y chromosome gene flow from the Ashkenazi and Roman Jewish communities. The Jewish and Middle Eastern non-Jewish populations were not statistically different. The results support the hypothesis that the paternal gene pool of Jewish communities from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East descended from a common Middle Eastern ancestral population, and suggests that most Jewish communities have remained relatively isolated from neighboring non-Jewish communities during and after the diaspora. That's study one. Study two. November 2001 study entitled Y Chromosome Pool of Jews as Part of the Genetic Landscape of the Middle East. All right? And I got all the citations here. This study shows that Ashkenazi Jews in particular, quote, share more common paternal lineages with other Jewish and Middle Eastern groups than with non-Jewish populations in areas where Jews lived in Eastern Europe, Germany, and the French Rhine Valley. It's consistent with Jewish traditions in placing most Jewish paternal origins in the region of the Middle East. And what these studies show, for instance, is that Jews in Russia or in Germany are more related, these are Ashkenazi Jews, are more closely related to Sephardic Jews in Spain or North Africa than they are with Germans around them or Russians around them. It's pretty interesting. Far more. In fact, they say the genetic distance is 6 times closer than the people around whom they live. And again, it shows you the link between the two populations. Study 3, September 2006, titled European Population Substructure, Clustering of Northern and Southern Populations. And it goes on to say, essentially, and this is what it said, found that both Ashkenazi Jews, and that's Ashkenazi Jews are supposedly the Eastern European and Northern European Jews, as well as Sephardic Jews, showed more than 85% membership in the Southern European group, which made their results consistent with the later Mediterranean origin of these ethnic groups. Study number 5, January 2009, a genome-wide genetic structure signature of Jewish ancestry perfectly separates individuals with and without full Jewish ancestry in a large random sample of European Americans. It found that, quote, individuals with full Jewish ancestry formed a clearly distinct cluster from individuals with no Jewish ancestry. The study showed that in DNA terms, Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazim, cluster as a distinct group, something that, if the Khazar theory were true, well, it'd be impossible, wouldn't it? Both Sephardic and Ashkenazim, because the Khazar theory basically says that the Khazars are completely unrelated to the Middle East, and Jews of the Sephardic region are the original Jews. Okay, 6. December 2009 study called Genomic Microsatellites Identify Shared Jewish Ancestry Intermediate Between Middle Eastern and European Populations. Jewish populations show a high level of genetic similarity to each other, clustering together in several types of analysis of population structure. These results support the view that Jewish populations largely share a common Middle Eastern ancestry and that over history they have undergone various degrees of admixture with non-Jewish populations of European descent. And what the studies show, by the way, is most of the recent studies, is that Jews who are Ashkenazi probably have about a 30% admixture, but they're overwhelmingly of non-European or Middle Eastern descent. Okay, number 7, December 2009 study, the genome-wide structure of the Jewish people. again, from a number of scientists, analyzed individuals from 14 Jewish diaspora communities, compared the patterns of their genome-wide diversity with those from 69 Old World non-Jewish populations in order to, quote, provide comprehensive comparisons between Jewish and non-Jewish populations in the diaspora, as well as with non-Jewish populations in the Middle East. The results identified a previously unrecognized genetic substructure within the Middle East, and that most Jewish samples form a remarkably tight subcluster, and that traces the origins of most Jewish diaspora communities to the Levant. Number 8, and I don't know if I'm going to have time in this broadcast to go through them all. You can read them all on my website. We can just go on. Here's another study. This says demonstrated distinctive Jewish population clusters, each with shared Middle Eastern ancestry. We can go on. This says this study also shows that the genetic proximity is incompatible with theories of that Ashkenazi Jews are for the most part direct lineal descendants of converted Khazars or Slavs. So Ashkenazis are not from Khazars. That's what the study indicates. Here's a March 2012 study by Stephen Bray, titled Signatures of Founder Effects, Admixture and Selection in Ashkenazi Jewish Population. It says found that, quote, Ashkenazi Jewish population is a common Middle Eastern origin with other Jewish diaspora populations. It says that Ashkenazi Jewish population had the most European admixture. Well, there is a slight difference, no question, between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. And so there's a difference. Jews went into Northern Europe along with the Roman Empire. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And that's where, in the early days when they had very small settlements and small numbers, there was likely to be a greater mixture. And then later on, as they established their communities, they were very, very strict about expelling from their community anybody that would then mix. But that's one reason why the admixture is there. Here's the 10th study, March 2012 study by Christopher Campbell, titled North African Jewish and Non-Jewish Population Form Distinctive Orthogonal Clusters. I mean, I can just go on and on. Compatible with the history of North African Jews founding during classical antiquity. And it just, again, shows the genetic closeness of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish groups. Number 11, A Legacy of the Genetic History of the Jewish People, Oxford University Press, Harry Oster, Professor of Pathology and Genetics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and Director of Genetic and Genomic Testing at Montefiore Medical Center, conclude the Jews exhibit a distinctive genetic signature. All right. Jews are a homogeneous group with all the scientific trappings of what we used to call a race. All right, there you go. He refutes the idea that they're descendant of converted Khazars. All right, and finally, I've got another study here, 12, the Jewish Hap Map Project, and that's another major study, and it shows exactly the same thing, that Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahi is another smaller section of Jews as compared to Ashkenazi and Sephardic, form a distinctive population cluster that's closely related to Semitic and European populations. Within this larger Jewish cluster, each of the Jewish populations formed its own subculture, or subcluster, excuse me. So again, it says that Ashkenazi may be slightly more related to each other than they are to Sephardim, but Sephardim and Ashkenazi share basically a overwhelmingly common heritage together. Nicholas Wade, the New York Times has an article. Nicholas Wade, in an article in that newspaper, follows that Jewish communities in Europe and the Middle East share many genes inherited from the ancestral Jewish population that lived in the Middle East some 3,000 years ago. And he goes on and on. It says Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews have roughly 30% European ancestry, most of the rest from the Middle East. The two studies find the two communities are very similar to each other genetically. So anyway, those are some of the most recent studies available, massive numbers of studies and very recent ones, and extremely detailed by all sorts of different sources and scientists. Now, the study they used to promote this Khazar theory among Jews is from a study by Eran El.Haik. And he's got a single study, and he's a single researcher, right? No group or anything. And he attempts to refute the massive earlier DNA evidence. Now, the massive DNA and genetic evidence is therefore overwhelmingly indicative, that despite a certain amount of European admixture among the Ashkenazim Jewry, there is still a clearly definable Middle Eastern genetic component to both Ashkenazim and Sephardic Jewry. Now, his paper, by the way, was The Missing Link of Jewish European Ancestry, contrasting the Rhineland and Khazarian hypothesis. Now, people have a sense of confirming their own bias, and those people who want to believe the Khazar theory, as soon as they saw this one study by this one Zio commie, basically, and proclaiming the Jews are not a race, all right? But they jumped on it because it fit their previous conclusion, because they read before and heard before so many times that Jews are in fact from the from the Khazar people, and that Ashkenazi are descended from them. Now, in a nutshell, El.Haik, and I got a picture of him on my site, take a look. It's really amazing to think that this person with this obviously Jewish physical appearance should, that by itself should indicate that there's indeed a common Jewish type. How else could many Jews be physically recognized as Jews? And those people who live around Jews a lot, whether it be in South Florida or New York City, most people who have experience with it can identify Jews very, very quickly by how they look. Not all Jews, of course. But how can a person who and these, in fact, all three of the Jews who quoted this theory look the same. And to my good engineer, I don't do this very often, but I like to cut the commercials today because I got so much to cover, and I want to complete this for one good video of the program later. I'm going to bring on Dr. Slattery at the end for a couple comments. He's listening carefully and analyzing some of this, and he'll probably have some prescient comments to make at the very end of the broadcast. This is an important broadcast because I think it's very, very critical to understanding and opposing Jewish extremism, Jewish supremacism, and Jewish racism. And generally speaking, racism is based or comes from certain racial alliances. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that even ethnocentric tendencies have an inherited component, personality component. As twin studies have shown this. And the closed gene pool would tend to exacerbate that kind of thing. And I really believe the real problem is not just Jewish organization, but it's the fact that there's absolutely a fact that there's a Jewish tribalism at work, and it's the tribalism, it's the racism that propels their power. So by saying, in effect, that the Jews are not a race or a people, what they're doing is they're indirectly trying to lessen the idea that tribalism has a lot to do with their power, or even the foundation of the state of Israel. You see, that they're trying to say that it's not racism for a race. It is. I mean, I think the evidence is overwhelming, and we're going to go into that now. Even though El.Haik's work is the only paper, I mean literally the only one, as opposed to literally dozens and hundreds, actually, of opposing DNA studies, this paper written by a single Jewish individual, as opposed to the others who are written by dozens and dozens of scientists from all over the globe, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, it's quickly become the most quoted proof of the Khazar theory. There's a lot of errors, though, in El.Haik's paper. And, for instance, he makes a lot of stupid errors about the geographic origin of the Khazars, and he actually makes errors about other races in terms of illustrating his points, such as one of his test sample groups, the Bdutu and the Biaka Pygmies. These two groups he asserts they're in South Africa. They're not at all found. They're not found in South Africa. They're found half a continent away in the Congo. But little errors like that show the sloppiness of research and show what's going on. This sloppiness is again repeated when El.Haik asserts that, quote, Eastern and Central European Jews accounting for approximately 90% of over 13 million worldwide Jews. That is just totally false. And there is no demographer on the planet that confirms those figures. In reality, the figure is far less. Of the estimated 13 million Jews worldwide, 8 million are Ashkenazim and 5 million are Sephardic. That's a division of 61%, quote, European Jews or Ashkenazim Jews, as compared to 39% non-European Jews, or almost 40%. And it should be pointed out that the Zionist state of Israel actually had a Sephardic and Mizrahi which is not Ashkenazi, Jewish majority. It's got the majority of the Zionist state of Israel is Sephardic. Sephardics actually worldwide have embraced Zionism in terms of going to Israel and supporting the Zionist vision more than Ashkenazi have. And in Israel, by the way, the Sephardim tend to be some of the most radical, like the Sephardic Rabbi Yosef, that says the only purpose for Gentiles is to serve Jews, and he talks about annihilating all the Arab people. Now, I mean, literally wiping their seed off the earth. Now, the actual facts on Jewish identity are readily available, and El.Haik's motivation for making this false claim could be ascribed to a desire to underscore his assertion, namely that Jews are not of Middle Eastern origin and that Jews are not a race or genetically similar people. And understand, again, how this plays into the hands of a very tribalist people. Oh, you see, the problem's only the Zionists, or the problem's only the Jewish religious extremists, you see. The problem goes way beyond that. The Jewish religion itself is full of Jews who literally are atheists. There is a people component to this. There is a ethnic component to it, a racial component to it. And you can't understand Zionism unless you understand that. As Golan Otzman points out, many other Jewish researchers, we have a lot of anti-Zionist Zionists, a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, but they tend to control the whole movement, and they don't even address the issue of the great crime that was committed against the Palestinian people to begin with. And I really believe that as in 1984, like George Orwell showed, the Emmanuel Goldstein, that was controlled opposition. And it's interesting, he used a very obvious Jewish name to show the controlled opposition, part of Big Brother. And I really think that, this may sound conspiratorial, but I really believe that these communist Jews, who literally are Zionists in many cases, for instance, Koestler, who wrote the book 13th Tribe, which I read probably when I was 13, 14 years old, and I believed the Khazar theory at that point. He absolutely, basically, forms a way of saying that the Jews are not a race, and which was going against all what previous anthropologists and geneticists and even National Socialists in Germany had said. He tried to say, "Oh, no, they're not a race," and understanding that or not understanding that, I think, is one of the reasons that we've been weak, because we haven't seen the tribal aspects of Zionism. I can go into a lot of the details of why El.Haik's methodology is wrong and why a lot of his research is absolutely inaccurate, but there's so many ways we can do it. Let's just talk about some of the aspects of some of the mistakes that this guy made. First off, one of the big problems in El.Haik's paper, it's not really a comparison, you see, truly comparison of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi. What it is a comparison. It's trying to compare Ashkenazi and Sephardic against other European populations. There's no Khazar DNA. El.Haik himself admits this in his paper. Khazars have been vanquished and their remains have yet to be sequenced. And by the way, in the Khazar Empire, we found some burial sites that we considered to be Khazars. But guess what those burial sites were showing? Mongoloid type people, or certainly with strong, true Asian admixture, if not dominantly Asian. And he didn't dare check the DNA of those compared to European Jewish populations. You see, there's no record of what Khazar DNA is unless you use those. Well, he certainly was sure not to use those. It's physically impossible to determine who's descended from it and who's not. If you don't have any original Khazar DNA, you can't really determine who's descended from it and who's not. Now, El.Haik attempts to circumvent this problem by selecting what he calls surrogate populations. It's contemporary Middle Eastern and Caucasus populations. But anybody with a basic understanding of historical events in the Caucasus in particular will understand immediately that El.Haik assertions that current populations in that region can be taken to reflect those of 1,500 years ago. That's very, very problematic and quite simply unsustainable. The Caucasus has been all kinds of populations ranging from Indo-Europeans, Semites, Mongols, and others. It is even today, highly genetically diverse. So a claim that this can be taken as any sort of yardstick in terms of DNA is dubious at the very least. His methodology in comparing DNA samples, and I'm sorry if I'm getting too scientific for some of you, bear with me, I'll get to some historical and more understandable parts in a minute, is to make an understatement unique to him. As Marcus Feldman, director of the Stanford University's Morrison Institute for Population Resource Studies, said, quote, El.Haik appears to be applying the statistics in a way that gives him different results from what everybody else has obtained from essentially similar data. Now, the interesting fact is that the study which was cited in the article, and this is the article I'm going to cite from a minute, Jews, a Race, Genetic Theory Comes Under Fierce Attack by DNA Expert, Jews as a Race. The study which was claimed cited in the article, the Jews as a Race, the Jews as a race, the studies that have shown Jews are a race before and after El.Haik are exactly the same conclusions that were reached by German National Socialists, anthropologists, and race scientists, and other anthropologists all over the world who studied race science in the United States and just about everywhere, Britain, everywhere. Many of the extensive studies done by the top geneticists of the modern day have been done by both Gentiles and Jews who can't be accused of any racial bias. El.Haik's arguments are completely refuted by the new and most massive study ever done of the Jewish genome. Titled No Evidence from Genome-Wide Data of Khazar Origin for the Ashkenazi Jews, was published in the Journal of Human Biology, August 2013, as you can see, very recent, by numbers of scientists. The paper emphasized this is the most complete, extensive study of the Jewish genome ever been done, with the most modern methods. Quote, this is what the study says: because the Khazar population has left no obvious modern descendants that could enable a clear test for contribution to Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, the Khazar hypothesis has been difficult to examine using genetics. Furthermore, because only limited genetic data has been available from the Caucasus region, and because this data has been concentrated in populations that are genetically close to populations from the Middle East, the attribution of any signal of Ashkenazi Caucasus genetic similarity to Khazar ancestry rather than shared ancestral Middle Eastern ancestry has been problematic. It goes on here, through integration of genotypes on newly collected samples with data from several of our past studies, we have assembled the largest data set available to date for the assessment of Ashkenazi Jewish genetic origins. Employing a variety of standard techniques for analysis of population genetic structure, we find that Ashkenazi Jews share the greatest genetic ancestry with other Jewish populations and among non-Jewish populations with groups from Europe and the Middle East. No particular similarity of Ashkenazi Jews with populations from the Caucasus is evident, particularly with the populations that most closely represent the Khazar region. Thus, analysis of Ashkenazi Jews together with large sample from the region of the Khazar Kagananet corroborates the earlier results that Ashkenazi Jews derive their ancestry primarily from populations in the Middle East and Europe, and they possess considerable shared ancestry with other non-Jewish populations, and that there is no indication of a significant genetic contribution from either within or from north of the Caucasus region. Okay, I'm proceeding with this. I'm sorry for the amount of the science here. So the latest up-to-date and modern DNA analysis has therefore completely refuted the Khazar theory. It is important to understand that this refutation has come from non-Jewish and Jewish scientists alike from dozens of different universities and genetic departments all over the world, and cannot be ascribed to any sort of conspiracy or plot. And it's hardcore scientific evidence that can be verified and that can be replicated by any scientist. So it's pretty consistent. And really, in this kind of issues of genetics, the genetic studies are the ultimate determinant. That's compared to any sort of apocryphal or any sort of historical analysis. But let's go into the historical record and see if there's any consistency. And let's talk about the historical. This is part 2, the historical logical evidence. One of the most obvious indicators of Jewish or genetic commonality is physical appearance. European people broadly resemble each other. You see a little bit of differences, for instance, with Scandinavians or say Italians or Spanish or different groups. You even see slight differences maybe between Irish and Scottish. I mean, you see slight differences among broad populations with, with some, some changes along the line. Other different African peoples broadly resemble each other. Chinese people broadly resemble each other. Australian Aborigines broadly resemble. It's a characteristic of genetically similar people to physically resemble each other. Now, Jews are no different in this regard than any other people. They too show a resemblance to each other, which is why it's possible to often recognize a Jewish person by his physical appearance. Not always, but quite often. A good example in point is the already mentioned Jewish geneticist Eran El.Haik, who, despite physically embodying a Jewish stereotype recognized around the entire world, he tries to claim that there's no genetic commonality about Jews and that Jews are not a race. The Khazar theory holds that most Ashkenazim Jews are not Semitic, but are Central Asian converts to Judaism. Proponents of the Khazar theory fail to understand the logical consequences of their belief, namely that a supposed Central Asian origin of the most Ashkenazim Jews means that they're not going to physically resemble other Jews. As anyone can see, Sephardic Jews are, on the average, slightly darker than Ashkenazim Jews, but there's no doubt there's a physical similarity which allows them to still be recognized as such. I have a picture, a fantastic picture. Go to my site, read this article, my friends. Study it. Rethinking the Khazar Theory. I show a picture of Barbra Streisand. Now, Barbra Streisand is absolutely of Khazar ancestry, Polish ancestry, northeastern European ancestry, pure Khazarian, right? I show a picture of Barbra Streisand, her skull structure, her facial structure, her nose, her lips, her eyes, her forehead, and so forth. And it's interesting because we contrast this picture of Barbra Streisand, an Ashkenazi Jew, with the only artistic rendition of Jews ever made on the pyramids of Egypt. And this was made, it was actually depicted, and exactly the hieroglyphics make it very clear. It's a picture of a Jewish leader of an Israelite trade delegation to Egypt. It's portrayed on the wall of the 18th dynasty, 1400 BC tomb of Sabogahoptop. I think that's the way you pronounce it. Thutmose the fourth of Egypt. So of an Egyptian pharaoh, the tomb of an Egyptian pharaoh. Folks, look at those pictures. Look at the picture. You would think that Barbra Streisand met her twin brother, almost an identical twin brother. I mean, it is an amazing picture, but it kind of illustrates the idea. Streisand's paternal grandparents came from Galicia in Poland, Ukraine, and her maternal grandparents from Russia. So if anyone would be a Khazar, according to that theory, it would be her. Nonetheless, she extremely resembles the only designated Jew as portrayed in the Egyptian tomb from almost 3,400 years ago, the leader of a Jewish trade delegation. The genetic continuity is clear. If the Khazar theory is true, there would be no physical similarity because there'd be a racial sea change in Jewish appearance. I show a picture of the famous banker of Pompeii, Jucundus, that's a nice name, who lived circa 20 to 62 AD, is identified by a Jew by the German anthropologist Hans F.K. Gunther in his book, The Racial Elements of European History. Now, alongside this Sephardic Jew, is pictured the Ashkenazi Jew, Abe Foxman of the ADL. Take a look. Now, this statue, by the way, of Jucundus was preserved perfectly in the ashes of Pompeii. All right? This is a time, hundreds and hundreds of years before any so-called Khazar conversion to Judaism. Take a look at the picture of the Jewish banker Jucundus and Abraham Foxman, who admittedly, family-wise, shows a perfect Ashkenazi heritage. Now, the similarities and this consistent showing of these kinds of similarities would be impossible if the Khazar theory was true. In addition to genetic studies, there have been extensive physiological and morphological studies. They've actually taken the bones of clear Jewish burial sites in what is now Israel and Palestine. They've taken these bones and they've studied the structure of the bones, the skulls, many other aspects of these figures, and they can literally, science can literally tell how closely related they are to other specimens, and they compare these bones to Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, and they find out that they're incredibly more similar, like 6 times more similar. The bones of the Ashkenazi Jews show 6 times more similarity to the ancient Jewish burial grounds in what is now Israel than they do to Russians around them, or Slavs around them, or Europeans around them. The same thing is true for the Sephardic Jews. That's amazing. Now, another piece of the jigsaw, which disproves the Khazar theory, is that Jewish supremacist behavior has remained constant through the millennia, from biblical times right to the present day. Now, most Christians are aware of the behavior of the Old Testament Jews who burn and rampage and rape and kill and ultimately reject God and reject Jesus according to the Gospels. And the fact that the Gospels of the New Testament show that the elite of Jews, the Pharisees, were the biggest enemies of Christ and arranged for his crucifixion. And the New Testament is clear that they led the persecution of Christians, which continued through both, not only in the New Testament, which is shown all through the Gospels, vicious Jewish persecution of Christians, but all the way up even and through Jewish Bolshevism and the persecution of Christians, by the way, even in Israel today, and by the cultural assault on Christian values by the Zio global media, which they brag about, which I've documented repeatedly. All right. Now, these Jews who arranged for the persecution, the crucifixion of Christ, and who are very radical Jews, and who persecuted Christians, they were around as a people, genetic people, hundreds and hundreds of years before the alleged conversion of any Jews in the Khazar Empire in the 9th century A.D. All our people constantly write about the Talmud, and the Talmud is an extremely racist, hyper-racist, oppressive a book of Jewish law. A paranoid book of really expressing hatred toward non-Jews, diminishing non-Jews like animals or not even human beings, and supporting oppressions against people. The Babylonian Talmud was written down, first codified. It came from an oral tradition even older than that. It was first codified and written down, right? When? Hundreds of years before any alleged Khazar conversion. If you look at histories, the Roman historian Socrates of Constantinople, not to be confused with Socrates of ancient Greece, he writes about the Jews were continually factious, and there was added to their ordinary hatred of Christians. This is writing over 1,500 years ago, right? Their ordinary hatred of Christians. Cyril, on being informed of this, sent for the principal Jews and threatened them with the utmost severities, lest they desisted from their molestation of the Christians. These menaces, instead of suppressing their violence, only rendered the Jewish population more furious and led to form conspiracies for the destruction of the Christians. Now, this is from a famous Roman historian, Socrates of Constantinople, folks, 1,500 years ago. And we can read Cicero. Cicero said, "Now let's take a look at the Jews and their mania for gold. You chose this site, Chief Prosecutor Lucilius, and the crowd which frequents it with an eye to this particular accusation, knowing very well the Jews with their large numbers and tendency to act as a clique are valuable supporters to have at any kind of public meeting." Again, showing Jewish tribalism, the same tribalism going on right now, folks. The same tribalism that gets them to dominate Hollywood. The same tribalism that is shown in the heads in the selection of the Federal Reserve. The same tribalism that's going on. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his famous work Histories, described the activities of the Jews as followers. In order to secure the allegiance of his people in the future, Moses prescribed for them a novel religion quite different from those of the rest of mankind. Among the Jews, all things are profane that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they regard as permissible that which to us seems immoral. The other practices of the Jews are sinister and revolting. They've entrenched themselves by their very wickedness. You know what Hollywood's doing. You know what the Jewish role in pornography. We can go on and on about these things. The famous British historian Edward Gibbon in his monumental work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, classifies all these things which look exactly similar to what's happened in the 20th century and the 21st century even. So we can go on and on. Finally, part 3, and I'm running out of time. I know what a program we have today. Again, I urge you to go to davidduke.com, read this long article, study it, and understand it. And if you would, I'm asking you to have an open mind and rethink the Khazar theory. Now, why has the Khazar theory come about? First of all, it was completely, really promoted in terms of its, in fact, the first big promotion of it in modern times, of course, is Arthur Koestler's, the 13th tribe, who was an out-and-out communist. In fact, he was actually a young member of a Zionist extremist group, the Jabotinsky group. And this is an attempt, in my opinion, to express it as that the Jewish problem is not really a tribal or an ethnic problem, but it's simply a Khazar or an Ashkenazi problem. And it's basically to divide our look. We don't look, these Jewish supremacists in America and Europe, they don't care whether somebody's Ashkenazi or Sephardic. They promote them. They honor. I can show you any Jewish organization honoring clearly Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, praising them. Their Jewish histories are full of that, Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews were dominant, for instance, even in Holland. They were dominant in Spain. They were dominant in all these cultures. All right? So, first off, it's a way, though. I get this thing every day. It's not the Jews that people tell me. It's the Khazars. Now, the Khazar theory is popular among anti-Zionists for the wrong reasons, because what they say is that, well, the Khazar theory is great because it shows the Jews don't have a relation to the Middle East. Therefore, they don't have any right to the land. Well, folks, they wouldn't have any right to the land anyway. But half of the Jews in Israel are Sephardic, more than half. Do they have the right to the land? What you're basically saying by that is somehow Jews would have the right to do what they've done, right? They'd have the right to do this if they were in fact related, and half the Jews are Sephardic, more than half. So that is a false argument and an ineffective argument. The Khazar theory, to me, is a tactic to disguise Jewish supremacist racism. It's related to the question of whether present-day Jews are religion or race, and prominent Jews refer to themselves today clearly as a race. It's for these reasons that I no longer believe the Khazar theory. And anyone who opposes Jewish supremacism, Jewish extremism, I consider an ally and a brother in the cause for the liberation of the European people and truly every people on the planet from the Zio-globalist threat. I accept wholeheartedly those who still believe, and if you still believe in the Khazar theory after reading and studying this, that's fine. You're a brother in this cause. But at the same time, I've got to express what I think from an academic way, historical perspective, what the truth is. Overall, this theory does more harm than good in our efforts to oppose Jewish tribalism, which is borne by the overwhelming elements of organized Jewry. I don't have much time for some comments from Dr. Slattery, but I'm sorry I spent so long, Doctor, but I had to go over a lot of material there. So what do you think?
Well, I think in general the Khazar theory is a red herring. It's gotten people off the track of what's really important, and of course, it's very attractive to people who would afford the modern day Jews a right to Israel if they had a historic connection. And of course, as you pointed out, there is no international legal basis for offering them a 2,000-year-old vacated piece of property based on their ancient ancestry. So it's really a red herring. It was attractive to, I think, a lot of religious people who don't like the idea of thinking of the modern day Jews who are so hostile to our interests. It's the same people that they became so attached to when they studied the Bible growing up and in church. But it's time to just like we need to open our eyes about all science around this. The science of genetics has become very well established. We're making great strides with it, and the evidence just is not there for a Khazar origin to the Ashkenazi people.
Well, that's it, folks. Thank you so much, Doctor, for that bit of comment, and would like to have longer, but I just wanted to go over all this data with you. Please, folks, read the article that we have, Rethinking the Khazar Theory. please open your mind to it, read it, study it, and just consider that the people who are advancing this theory, this one Jewish study was written by a Jew who, even by his own physical appearance, shows the fact there's a genetic common lineage there between both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. And just look at the fact that those who are presenting this have really communist backgrounds. And they're basically trying to say that there is no really a Jewish tribalist problem, that is simply a question of Zionism or Jewish colonialism in the Mideast, when we know that the problem is a worldwide problem of Jewish racism and supremacism. And by not understanding that the Jews are a people, an identifiable people, it lessens the understanding of the tribalist racism that propels and enables their power. So I hope all of you understand this and agree with this, and I look forward to you reading the article. I'm looking forward to getting to your response to it. I think this is going to spread throughout the movement of our liberation or anti-Zionist movement, and I think it needs to. And I think we've got to approach this issue. So please read and study and have an open mind on this issue. Whether you agree with the Khazar theory or disagree with it in the end, if you are fighting against the Zionism and the crimes of the Jewish extremists, you are my brother and my ally, and I hope that you will consider me an ally, even though I may have a disagreement with you if you don't accept my consideration that the Khazar theory is simply truly, it's a matter of Jewish misdirection from the real issues. Thanks so much, folks. I'm out of time. I'll see you again tomorrow. About this program, you and I together can change the world.
This is Richard Ostro, owner for Carnivora Research International. In 1985, former President Ronald Reagan requested that Carnivora be sent directly to the White House from Europe, where it was manufactured at the time, effectively making him the first American to use Carnivora. He used it successfully for a serious immune challenge, which we are prohibited from mentioning in the United States. I would like to add that he used Carnivora approximately 8 years prior to the onset of his Alzheimer's condition, for those of you inadvertently connecting the two events. Visit us at carnivora.com, now used in 27 countries around the world. Carnivora instinctively seeks out abnormal cells only that don't belong in the body without harming a single normal cell. 100% pure, natural, and harmless to humans and animals. Call 1-866-VENUS-FLY. That's 1-866-VENUS-FLY, or visit carnivora.com. Your immune system will thank you.
You're listening to the Rense Radio Network, nationwide and worldwide on the net and at rense.com.